Okay, so as I was saying before, so thank you for the invitation. I'm going to be sharing some of the work that we have been doing with the Colombian families with autosomal-dominant Alzheimer's disease. I have nothing to disclose. And since this is the first lecture about the women in neuroscience, I wanted to tell you something about how I became interested in neuroscience and how I actually came to be an associate professor now in the Harvard Medical School. And I'm originally from Colombia, from Antioquia, and I joined the group of neuroscience in the late 90s. And when I was there, I had the opportunity to join Dr. Francisco Lopera, the one here, that I was working with these extended families from Colombia that have autosomal dominant Alzheimer's disease. He, in collaboration with Dr. Ken Kosick, discovered the first family that have a mutation in the presenting one. And this mutation is now called the PISA mutation, and it's a mutation in the presenting one that is the E288 mutation. Back in the time, so when I was an undergraduate, there was no formal training for us in neuroscience. That was the first opportunity that I have to actually learn about neuroscience and learn about everything that was happening with the brain. And with Dr. Lopera's guidance and also with his collaborators at that time, we created the group of Synapses, that was a student-led group, when we actually created opportunities to learn about neuroscience at that point. The group that I was actually launched in 1999 is still around more than 20 years later. And it's a group that is there in the university to teach students about the neuroscience. The students that are majoring in psychology, students that are majoring in medicine, engineering, and other sciences as well. So in the 2000s, so I actually moved to the US. And as part of moving to the US, so the first thing that I had to do was learning English. And as part of the learning English, so I prepared myself to get into grad school. So I completed my master's degree and my PhD at Boston University. And as part of the training that I got at Boston University, I was able to learn the tools and get the tools to complete a fMRI, functional MRI in general. And I was able to bring these tools back to Colombia, to my hometown. I'm going to be telling you more about the science of this work, but something that I'm very proud of is that I was actually able to bring this knowledge to Colombia and collect the data in Colombia with these families and bring these families closer to what we were able to do in the next decade, in the 2010, that I was bringing the families closer to the first clinical trial that is still ongoing, that all this knowledge that we have based on the structural and functional studies that we did as part of my PhD was instrumental for them to be able to participate in clinical trials. So then moving forward, as part of when I completed my PhD, I received a very competitive US NIH Directors Pioneer Award, or a DP5 award, that I was able to, and I was able to launch the COLBOS study, and I'm going to be describing more in detail in the next couple of slides. And with the COLBOS study, we pretty much opened a window to what was happening in the brains of these individuals several years before symptoms. And getting closer to that, we also were able to learn about novel pathways that are now informing in novel treatments of the disease. So in terms of academic trajectory, and this is just to give you a summary of where everything has happened for me. So I joined Harvard Medical School and the Massachusetts General Hospital faculty as an instructor. That is very early a junior faculty position in 2014. So I became assistant professor in 2016, associate professor in 2020, and I was recognized as an NGA research scholar in 2020. So just putting together in all this slide, you can see how pretty much like it has been a long process, a long trajectory for me, but something that is something that I wanted to highlight, like doesn't happen alone, like it takes a lot of components to actually get to where you are. And something that I always say, determination is key in accomplish everything that you want to accomplish. I always said, like, if you want to get something, just, yeah, keep trying. And also having the support of your mentors, it has been key for me in particular, like having the early support of Dr. Lopera was critical, but after that, like having the support of other mentors at different stages of my career, even like in the master's program, the PhD, the postdoctoral fellowship, at all the levels of my career, and even now as a faculty, has been crucial. So for the ones that are listening that are more a junior and in the career, so just remember that getting the right mentorship is very critical for your success and helping you advance in your career. So just in terms of the science, I'm gonna be explaining more about the work that we have been doing. So just to make sure that everybody's on the same page. So Alzheimer's disease, as you may know, most of the cases are explained by sporadic causes. So about 90–95% of the cases are explained by cases that are causes that are sporadic, are usually found in individuals over the age of 65. The most important risk factors are age, family history, and the gene, the APOE4, that is a genetic risk factor. And there is a minority of cases, less than 5 or even 2% of cases that are explained by mutations. There are mutations in autosomal-dominant mutations that are genes, mutations in PRCLIN1, different from the sporadic, more common late onset disease. These ones start before the age of 65. They are nearly 100% penetrant, and they have a specific age or onset. So in the past decades, so Alzheimer's disease has moved to this conceptualization that Alzheimer's is a continuum of the disease. So now we are talking about the preclinical Alzheimer's disease. There is this phase or stage of the disease that comes several years before the individuals start showing symptoms. And now we know, like most of the treatments, all of the treatments that are available are symptomatic treatments. And the goal is to actually be able to start treatments before the individual shows symptoms. So we can actually be able to delay the clinical onset of symptoms or even prevent the symptoms altogether. Why it's important to actually detect symptoms, detect the individuals in preclinical stages, because as I mentioned, that help us to early initiate treatments and also prevent the disease in the future. So one way to do this is to actually have biomarkers of the disease. And this is not just for Alzheimer's, but in general, biomarkers help us to detect the disease, stage of disease, help us to monitor progression, and also it helps us to monitor the response to treatment when treatments are available. There are two ways to go about studying biomarkers in Alzheimer's disease. One is the sporadic form, using the sporadic form of Alzheimer's disease, and the other one is studying the familial Alzheimer's disease. And as I already gave it away in the first slide, so my work has been using the form of Alzheimer's disease, that is the familial Alzheimer's disease, as I also briefly mentioned at the beginning. So this is a work that has been over a 30-year journey. So in Colombia, we started characterizing families that have these forms of the disease. And the work that we have been doing in collaboration with Dr. Lopera's group has been going after clinical assessments, then genetic characterization. And my contribution to their team has been the neuroimaging and characterization of biomarkers, and also, as I mentioned, with the goal of moving these families closer to clinical trials and treatments. So most of the work that we have been doing has been with Alzheimer's disease, but we also have families with other forms of the disease, like CADASIL, there is a vascular form of the disease, Huntington disease, frontotemporal disease, Parkinson's disease, and others. So these families that we have in Colombia, they carry this mutation in the E288, mutation, the PRCLIN1, they are pretty much destined to develop Alzheimer's disease. They develop mild cognitive impairment at the age of 44, and they develop dementia at the age of 49. And as I mentioned before, most of them, they are pretty much destined to develop the disease. There are several similarities between this form of the disease and the most typical form, that is the late onset sporadic AD. So my work has been to identify some of the earliest changes that individuals that carry this mutation have in their brains that can help us to identify individuals that are predisposed to develop Alzheimer's disease in the future. So this is some of the work that I mentioned at the beginning that I did as part of my PhD. And what we did was we compared older carriers, this was older carriers versus non-carriers. And by older carriers, I mean older than 25. The same, remember that they develop MCI, mild cognitive impairment at the age of 44. And we found that even at this age, they have hyperactivation of the hippocampus. So then we went even younger and we compared the carriers at from 18 to 25 years old. And we found that in addition to the hyperactivation of the hippocampus, they also have some hyperactivation in other regions, particularly the parietal regions. And then we went even younger and studied the children and teenagers from 9 years to 18 years. And we found that the hippocampus was no different from the non-carriers, but we found this hyperactivation of parietal regions in the carriers compared to the non-carriers. We also look at the cortical thinning, and we found that the carriers compared to the non-carriers, they have thinner cortex even before they have symptoms. And we also use ERPs, that is even related potential, and we found a greater activation of posterior regions in the carriers compared to the non-carriers. All of this together was pretty much telling us that there was some evidence of brain changes in cognitively pre-symptomatic or unimpaired individuals many years before clinical onset. And as I mentioned at the beginning, it was given us some information about that there were changes happening in the brain several years and even decades before the individuals had cognitive symptoms. After that, so what we did is that we would have access to other biomarkers, and we use biomarkers in CSF, amyloid PET, and hippocampal volume, and we saw that the earliest changes in other biomarkers were changes in amyloid levels as measured in CSF. So when we actually move, and this is something that we were able to publish just recently, like 2 years ago, we started looking at plasma biomarkers, and this is like 2 papers that we did using a plasma levels of NFL and p-tau, and comparing carriers versus non-carriers. We were able to show that even like just by using plasma biomarkers, the levels of these biomarkers were able to distinguish carriers from non-carriers 20 years before they actually have cognitive symptoms. And when we compare directly p-tau to 17 versus NFL, p-tau was a better predictor of cognitive decline, or it was more sensitive to NFL. This is still work that is ongoing, but it's another path for biomarkers as well. So in 2014, so as part of the DP5 grant that I mentioned, so I was able to launch the COLBOS project that is called for Colombia and BOST for Boston. And as part of this study, so I was able to bring Colombians to Boston. So members of the families from Colombia were able to travel to Mass General for biomarker studies. Particularly, we were interested in getting the PET imaging studies that were not available in Colombia. As part of that, the main questions was actually to see if amyloid accumulation in the brain was actually seen before or after accumulation of tau. As you may know, like amyloid and tau and tau pathology are the hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease. So at this point, we didn't have evidence in vivo in these individuals in this kindred. So with the first 56 that were able to travel to Boston, we were able to show that the carriers had elevated amyloid pathology as early as 28 So we also were able to show that carriers, they have increased tau pathology in their late 30s, a few years before clinical onset, in particular about the age of 36, 38. We also were able to show that increased tau levels in pathology were only seen in the setting of substantial cortical amyloid deposition in the brain. So meaning only the ones that have a very high levels of amyloid were actually the ones that have high levels of tau. And then also the tau pathology was correlated with measures of amyloid deposition and cognitive decline. The other thing that we saw here is like the MCI individuals, the ones that we included that had mild cognitive impairment, as you can see here, by the time that they actually start developing symptoms, tau pathology is pretty much extended in the neocortex. So in 2017, I got another one that from the NIH to actually do the longitudinal follow-up study. And it's pretty much the individuals from Colombia were able to come back for follow-up evaluations, examinations. And they were coming back every 18 months until COVID hit us, and we needed to stop the study until a few months ago. So what we were able to learn, and this we published this last year with all the data that we have available, it was that as predicted, the carriers have a great accumulation of tau and amyloid. And this one here is the accumulation of amyloid over time. And the same, like they also have accumulation of tau over time. And here I'm just showing the three main regions that we focus: entorhinal, inferior temporal, and precuneus. And something that is very interesting and is getting even more interesting as we learn more about this pathology in the kindred, is that the accumulation of the tau pathology in the precuneus seems to be the accumulation seems to be like greater compared to accumulation in other regions, especially the ones in the middle temporal lobe regions. So here you can see, and this is not a work that Justin Sanchez took the lead of. You can see that in blue, you have the unimpaired carriers, and in red, the few impaired carriers that have longitudinal data at this point. So you can see the amyloid has this rise that is very sharp in general, very steady increase, but this is amyloid and this is tau. But tau seems to be really like accumulation, nothing really happens until the point that they get really close to the all the way until they pass the age of clinical onset. With tau is more sharp increase as they get closer to the age of clinical onset. So the conclusions from this longitudinal work is that carriers have greater tau and amyloid change relative to non-carriers. The accumulation appears to be steady, as I mentioned. Amyloid beginning as early as 20 years prior to dementia onset. In contrast, tau seems to be more rapid and widespread in the neocortex and closer to the time to symptom onset. Tau and amyloid change are correlated. And something that is very interesting and still we are seeing in all the studies that we're doing is like tau, either baseline tau or change or tau are more closely linked to memory decline than any measures that we have in amyloid. So with all of these and with all the data that we have now for COLBOS, so as you may imagine, we have many other questions and sub-studies that we're trying to answer now, trying to understand the association between biomarkers, protective factors, risk factors, and a clinical onset. We have started looking at physical activity, sleep, sex differences, cardiovascular risk factors, neuropsychiatry symptoms, and like a heavy component is cognition, looking at some of the cognitive markers that can help us predict some of the subtle changes in cognition as well. And we have some work looking at genetic factors that I'm going to be describing in a few minutes as well. So in this context, I designed the association between looking biomarkers, how biomarkers can actually help us to detect or inform risk factors, finding cognitive resilience, and ultimately with the goal of finding ways to prevent memory decline or delay memory decline. So I'm just gonna show you some of the examples. This is one of the applications, is one of the way that we hope to have also for the clinical populations at large. So how the early diagnosis of cognitive decline and dementia can actually benefit from our work. So something that we did, for instance, with the Colombian kindred, like we validated the Latin American Spanish version of the face name test. And this is a measure that has been shown to be sensitive to preclinical changes in Alzheimer's disease. So we validated the version in Spanish, and after we validated that and we created norms for this test, we used the measure in the COLBOS kindred to see if the measure was actually sensitive to subtle changes in preclinical stages, and if that was sensitive also, or there was association with biomarker data. And this is the task, how the task looks like, and the same like the task is actually available. So if anybody wants to use it, just send me an email. I will be happy to send you all the files. But it has like a learning, immediate face recognition, recall, and recognition. And then what we found is like the task alone, in terms of behavioral performance, was actually able to distinguish carriers from non-carriers. So, which means like, as a matter of fact, we confirmed that it's very sensitive to preclinical Alzheimer's disease. But more than that, when we actually were able to compare with amyloid and tau, you can see the association here, the performance and the task, in particular here, just looking at the total score in the task was associated with the levels of amyloid pathology. So meaning like those that had worse performance in the task, but also the ones that had greater amyloid pathology in the brain. And the same, like, remember, this is only with cognitively unimpaired individuals. So meaning like they still are performing within normal range. And the same with entorhinal cortex, the ones that with worse performance, they also have greater tau pathology. And when we look at the exploratory analysis in the whole brain, we can see that the performance in the task was actually associated in terms of the regions that were more linked to regions that are in amyloid and tau associated with the risk for Alzheimer's disease as well. So we try to do this with other tasks as well, and using this one that is the visual short-term memory or the color shape binding. It was not as sensitive as the face name. We also did this one with the free and Q. It was not as sensitive, but the same, like with the goal of trying to find like the earliest detection with all subtle cognitive changes in individuals at risk. Other work that we have been doing is kind of like, this is something very recent that we just published a few months ago, looking at subjective cognitive decline and the association with biomarkers. We are also looking at changes in personality, for instance, and see how some traits like neuroticism can actually be indicative of risk for Alzheimer's disease as well. Other biomarkers that we have extended study now, it's like it goes beyond to something that can be applied, like retinal imaging, for instance, and it's another line of work that we are looking into right now. We are now studying also the associations between plasma biomarkers, including the ones that I mentioned, the NFL and the p-tau, and how these biomarkers can actually help us to inform changes in brain pathology, like PET imaging and cognitive decline, several years after as well. It's another line of research. And we're also using the biomarker data that we have to see if we can actually identify subtle changes in the structures that can be relevant for like symptoms that we know that can help us to predict change. Kind of like, for instance, in this case, in the thalamic regions that have been linked to sleep dysfunction, for instance, or the changes in cortical thickness that have been also linked to changes, as I mentioned at the beginning, for cortical thickness before symptoms. And some of the most recent work that we have been doing, as I also presented at the beginning, is trying to characterize the children that are at risk of developing this disease and see if we can find like some of the earliest biomarkers, the early changes in the children that are like 30 years before they actually have any kind of cognitive symptoms. To conclude, to finalize the part of the talk, so I'm going to briefly mention some of the genetic factors that we have been also linked in this study as in 2017. So I launched the COLBOS strain. And it's pretty much as part of the work that we're doing with Dr. Lopera, we identified some individuals that belong to the Colombian families that they carry this mutation, the presenilin-1, the E288 mutation, but despite having this risk to develop Alzheimer's disease, dementia in their 50s, they pretty much remain cognitively intact. So we created this project called COLBOS to study the ones that remain unimpaired. And the first case that we reported in Nature Medicine in 2019, was an individual, Doña Lidia, that she actually remained impaired until her 70s. So 3 decades after the expected age of onset for her. So she was very healthy when we saw her. And the only thing that she had was that she had hyperlipoproteinemia or hypercholesterolemia when we saw her. And cognitively, she was just starting to have some symptoms, but she was still very early with my cognitive impairment. We found in some of the genetic tests that we did with her that she was also a carrier or a homozygous for another mutation, that it was the mutation of the APOE3, the Christchurch mutation. And this mutation that is located in the amino acid 136 has been reported to be important for the binding between the APOE protein and also the LDL receptors and the glycosaminoglycans, such as the heparin and the HPSG. So what we reported, she came also, as part of the COLBOS project, she came to Boston. She went to all the same examinations and the same procedures that everybody else did. And what we found that it was quite remarkable on her, as you can see here, the first row, it's like her brain have a lot of amyloid, as you can see in red here. And this is she compared with a typical MCI from the kindred. But when we actually look at her levels of tau, that is the second row, this is her and this is somebody else from the kindred, her levels of tau were very limited. And this is another way to see or here, she's the one in red, a lot of amyloid compared to anything else, and very limited tau compared to anybody else in the kindred. And then we also look at some of the hippocampal volumes and also the glucose metabolism. And as you can see here, the glucose metabolism for her was really good. So pretty much she has no glucose hypermetabolism, and her hippocampal volume was also relatively preserved compared to any of the other carriers from the families. So pretty much the imaging showed limited tau pathology and neurodegeneration despite having high amyloid plaque accumulation when we saw her. So some of the experimental work showed that the Christchurch mutation was actually important for the binding between APOE and the HSPGs. And this binding is very important in terms of a new avenue for Alzheimer's disease treatment. HSPGs have been already implicated in several functions, or they have been important in regulation of base activities, amyloid aggregation and uptake, amyloid-induced inflammation, and also neuronal tau uptake and propagation, which they say seems very relevant for her case in particular. And this is still work that is ongoing for us, but something that it has been quite important that we have learned from her case is that it showed us that APOE may not be limited only to the accumulation or amyloid pathology, for instance, but also it has some direct implications into the tau pathology. In her case in particular, it has been very clear that the protection can be also linked to the tau pathology, and also this protection being mediated, at least in part, by the magnitude of this binding between APOE and HSPG. As part of the work that we reported in the paper and that we still are doing in collaboration with our colleagues, particularly Dr. Jose Arboleda, is like developing some antibodies that can actually mimic this binding between APOE, reducing this binding between APOE and HPSG, and as another way to pretty much potentially treat Alzheimer's disease. So most of this work, as I mentioned, is ongoing. And some of the questions that remain that are still in process has to do with the mechanisms of neuroprotection. We still don't have the answer for that. There are some work in vitro, in vivo that is ongoing. Hopefully at the end of this year, we will have some more answers there. We are also trying to characterize the other Christchurch mutation carriers that we have identified in the Colombian kindred. We are in the process of characterizing those individuals as well. As I mentioned at the beginning, she is the first one that we identified that she remained unimpaired until older ages. We are also in the process of characterizing the other escapees or the other individuals that remain unimpaired, and hopefully we will learn more from them as well as we move forward with this project. So this is just to summarize like her case. It has been quite remarkable, like all the knowledge that we have actually gained from her. So one patient can actually inform the genomics, basic science, drug science, and drug discovery, and hopefully in the future can also lead us to clinical trials. More than that, if at least for me, is like one patient that actually came from this kindred of more than 6,000 individuals that we have been following for over 30 years can be actually help us to, hopefully in the future, to have the answer to treat Alzheimer's disease. So to conclude, families with autosomal-dominant mutations provide a unique opportunity to study disease progression from preclinical to clinical stages. They can help us to develop and, as I show you, improve measures for early detection, implement early intervention, and also clinical trials. Future longitudinal studies of these populations are still needed. As I mentioned, so we are still in the process of learning more about this biomarker trajectory and also more about the other specific mutations. There is still more that we need to learn about the escapees. As I mentioned, we are still in the process of characterizing those as well, especially the ones that remain unimpaired and older ages. Future studies, as I always say, should include new families with early onset dementia. Most of the work that I show you is based on one mutation. There are several mutations that explain autosomal-dominant Alzheimer's disease, so we have a lot of work to do there as well. I want to end by thanking everybody that is part of my lab in the Familial Dementia Neuroimaging Lab, the Multicultural Alzheimer's Prevention Program. And my collaborators are the Harvard Aging Brain Study, the Group of Neurosciences, University of Antioquia, and all the collaborators in the other institutions as well. And of course, thank you to the families in Colombia for being committed to research and working with us all these years. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Quiroz, for that really comprehensive and exciting talk. I'm really impressed with the breadth of your research. So thank you so much for accepting this invitation, giving us our talk today. Yes, if there's questions, Alex, I'm not sure how you want to do this. We let the person speak or type the question in. I guess you can just unmute and ask your question. Yes, exactly.
Well, I just raised my hand. Oh, can I ask the question?
Absolutely, go ahead.
Okay. Thanks, Dr. Quiroz, for this nice talk and very impressive work that you have done on the autosomal-dominant Alzheimer's disease mutation. I would like to know, do you have an idea of the Christchurch mutation? Is it predictive only for the familial Alzheimer's disease, or have you seen some sporadic case that are a carrier of this mutation?
Yeah, I'm just gonna stop sharing so I can see, try to see who asked the question because I couldn't. So So yeah, so the mutation is very rare in the general population. So the Christchurch, that's one of the limitations. But like for instance, at least in Colombia, we are now trying to also trying to identify individuals outside the Colombian kindred, like in the general population, to see if we can actually get a better sense of how protective it is in the ones that don't have the presenilin-1 mutation. So that's one of the questions that we have, to see if having the Christchurch mutation alone in the context or without the context of the presenilin mutation can have any kind of protection at all. So yeah, so hopefully in the next, hopefully a few months, I will be better positioned to answer that question.
Thanks.
I think Christian is next.
Hey, yeah, thank you very much. Very, very nice talk. Great work as always. I was wondering, in your biomarker, blood biomarker studies, you have, I think if I understood correctly, mainly looked at established AD biomarkers. Have you considered to do some discovery work to see if there might be some amazing biomarker we haven't even thought about? I mean, you have this really, like unique case where you know the outcome and you can go back all these samples before and after. So
the answer is yes. So we actually have a project for a biomarker discovery, and we will be actually doing that very soon. So yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
I have a question. So we're all used to seeing the biomarker trajectory of sporadic AD, and now you've shown us, or we've also seen, but specifically today, the trajectory for autosomal dominant AD. So it seems like in autosomal dominant, you have the amyloid, but the correlation is more with the tau. And then when we go back to sporadic AD, even though amyloid is again pushed as the initiator, we also have some literature showing us that it could be maybe the vascular clearance of amyloid or something to do with the vasculature. So if you were to compare like autosomal dominant versus sporadic AD, what are the similarities and differences that one can come away with?
No, and I think that's a really good point that you bring, because one of the main differences that like autosomal dominant Alzheimer's disease is more like it's a more pure model of Alzheimer's disease, in the sense like most of the individuals that we follow, for instance, are relatively young. And as I mentioned, so they develop a mild cognitive impairment in their 40s, and they develop dementia in their 50s. So like all the complications that are even like age-related comorbidities that actually go with like a vascular disease is something that we know that increases as we get older. And as I also mentioned in the presentation, like age is one of the main risk factors for like late onset Alzheimer's disease. And so far, so some of those risk factors, they don't have it. Because that's something that by age, they're still not there. So something that we have explored and examined like this, and like vascular risk factors, cardiovascular risk factors, they usually don't have that many because they are still very young. But so that's one of the main differences. That's saying like other changes that we may see, like for instance, in terms of like white matter diseases and everything that we may see that is changed or is already abnormal in them, we know almost for sure that is something that is related to Alzheimer's disease, not necessarily to age or vascular disease or other changes, which is also something that, at least for me, is something that is very informative, meaning like any other abnormality that we see in the brains of these individuals that is related to, as I was mentioning, like white matter abnormalities that we are seeing in their brains that are linked to amyloid pathology, for instance, are very likely to be related to Alzheimer's disease. Not with the late onset form of the disease, that it could be just age-related comorbidities, or it's messier in late onset Alzheimer's disease. That for us, that is it's more like it's a very clear picture. That's a big difference.
Are there other questions? Okay, I have another one then. So the world today knows a lot about amyloid antibody and the various trials. And we know that the autosomal dominant is mostly due to amyloid. It's the APP mutation and the presenilin 1 or 2, which all is in the amyloid pathway mutations. How are the amyloid antibodies working in the autosomal dominant families? Like, do we see improvement, or do we specifically have to target the different entities that you talked about today?
So the first clinical trial that I mentioned during my presentation, that is actually an anti-amyloid therapy, and is ongoing. So hopefully during this year, mid-year in 2022. So we will have the answer for that. So pretty much like we will actually know if that works or not in these families. So we actually don't know for sure if it works or not. So it's kind of like the first clinical trial that is happening. So the hypothesis there is kind of like we actually lower the levels of amyloid. So maybe lowering the levels of amyloid, so the levels of tau will remain lower too. So, but it will remain to be seen. So pretty much we will need the data to see if that's actually the case. But at least, as I mentioned, with the Colombian families, this is the first clinical trial. So yeah, so we will need to see.
Okay, I have one more question, which might highlight the focus you've given in Alzheimer's research on really trying to look at different ethnicities and different cohorts. We know that ADNI is maybe the new ADNI branch, not so much, but current ADNI is very focused on the majority of one ethnicity. And I know a lot of the other cohorts around the world are also like, they're not as diverse as we would like to think. In your opinion, what is the importance of integrating multicultural cohorts in the Alzheimer's work? Is it okay? I'm just being the devil's advocate here, but is it okay to just have one ethnicity or one majority ethnicity and look at it, or do we gain knowledge by looking at different ethnicities? And if so, what might these factors be?
Yeah, and I think that the answer is like we should have diverse cohorts, because the same, like as part of the knowledge, like we will need to actually have a diverse cohorts to actually be prepared to answer that question, is we need it or not. But in our own work, and the same, like I didn't present that today because I focused on the Colombian work, but and also the PI, or the Boston Latino Aging Study. So as part of the work that we are doing in the Boston Latino Aging Study, so we are actually collecting biomarker data, including like neuroimaging data, PET imaging data, in the older Latino individuals here in Boston. And we are comparing the data with what has been collected as part of the Harvard Aging Brain Study, which most of the individuals that are part of the Harvard Aging Brain Study, they are actually white Caucasians. And what we are actually doing, like, and some of the preliminary data that we have, so far shows that the cutoff that we use, for instance, in terms of defining what is amyloid positive, for instance, for one group versus the other one, maybe not be the same for one group and the other one. So like stuff like that can be informative, particularly for clinical trials, for instance, and so far. So how we select individuals to participate in trials, how do we actually go about like following individuals over time. So I think that it's going to be informative. We just started last year, but I think that we need more diverse cohorts to learn about how we actually including and selecting participants.
I think there's a question from Nicole. Nicole, go ahead.
Yes, very nice talk. Thank you very much for this. Yeah, it was a beautiful talk. I'm wondering, did you look at tau modification, like phosphorylation in time, longitudinally? Do you see it modify over time? And if it is it different from the sporadic cases?
That's a really good question. We haven't.
Okay.
We haven't looked at that yet. So yeah.
Yeah.
So we should, yeah, we should, but we haven't done that. All this, the longitudinal piece, yeah, I would say like it's still ongoing, and unfortunately because of COVID kind of like get interrupted, and we don't have enough samples with longitudinal follow-up, but yes, so something that I definitely want to do in the future.
Okay, thank you.
Since you brought up the COVID, and we know that APOE, at least in the example you gave today, has a big, it's a big factor. And we know there's some links with APOE and COVID severity. Is this something that you can comment on, or is there ongoing research going in how COVID may or may not increase age-related dementias, and specifically Alzheimer's disease throughout the world?
Not from my own work, but I know that at least in the US level, the NIH has an initiative that they are going to be looking into that at the national level here. So there is kind of like, if I remember correctly, I forgot the name. It's called Discover. I forgot, but this is like a national initiative, and one of the goals is to actually study some factors, and APOE is one of them.
So it is past 1 o'clock. Is there any last question or two from the audience? If not, I might go ahead and close the talk by thanking Dr. Quiroz for sitting through a very interesting beginning. Thank you for your patience and not just making the seminar series come to a close too early. I'm sure our trainees who might have left by now had additional questions for you as a woman in neuroscience, and additional factors that might have affected your choice in your research, things that you needed to overcome. So I think I will encourage them to maybe reach out to you if that is the case, if they couldn't be here today to ask those questions. But I very, very much thank you from the bottom of my heart for accepting my invitation and being here today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for the invitation. I appreciate it. Bye.
Yeah.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.